And I think a big piece of this too is whether it's intentional or not, when you are creating a project or feeding into a problem and providing a solution, oftentimes people are unintentionally cherry picking research that confirms their bias, that confirms what they already believe. So challenging that even amongst yourself, like you said, is so powerful for providers too. Like if you are a provider listening, take that advice. Like that is huge. And that is what makes us well-rounded and able to continue questioning things and really looking for what is best for each patient, you know?
Oh yeah, this
But
like you can find a study to support just about anything.
yes,
It doesn't mean the
totally.
study's good. It doesn't mean it's valid. It doesn't mean it's reliable. But you can find like there's studies that say water has memory. Huh. But when you actually look at like the methods to the approach, you see like they just they just were doing their feels in that study.
Yes.
And so that's where you
Yeah.
have to say like I can find a study, and that's where reference lists alone on things aren't enough. And I hate that. I hate that we can't just trust, right? I
Yeah.
hate that we can't just be like,
Yeah.
these providers are sharing the best evidence that they have found, but unfortunately, they're finding the evidence that supports their narrative,
Yeah. That
ignoring the rest.
totally. And I think what's really challenging for parents is that, I mean, even for me, like I know how to look at research. And there are times where I'll catch myself like reading the abstract and I'm like, whoa, and like forming a thought about the paper and not taking the time to read it all the way through. And so I think for some parents who maybe have absolutely no background in identifying pseudoscience and misinformation and research that is being cherry picked, I think it's really important that maybe we share some tips about how can parents go about navigating the minefield of social media, not even just about retained primitive reflexes, but just in general, when a healthcare professional that you are trusting as the expert in that area is throwing information at you that seems legitimate, how can parents kind of identify it with if they have no understanding of really dissecting methodology and all of those things, how can we help them identify times where it might be cherry picked or where it might be pseudoscience or that sort of thing?
So I'm gonna share a couple different things here. First and foremost is being aware. So like listening to this podcast right now and recognizing like, ooh, I should be aware of these things. Like that is first. Also, the other thing that I always like to say around identifying pseudoscience, being aware of misinformation, being aware of all these tactics, this is something that is a skill you can develop. So being aware is first. But from there, it's something that you can fine tune, you can get better at, you can improve over time as you identify, you fact check, you spend the time to do that a little bit. And I recognize we don't have a lot of time, but like if even just one time you see a post and you go, okay, I'm going to like open up a tab and I'm going to type in what I saw and I'll read more about it later. That's perfect. Like, and you have a late night feed with a newborn or, after bedtime, you have a second, you're like, ooh, let me go visit that again. Because it is a skill that gets better with time. Like fact checking and being aware of these things, you start to be like, oh, that for sure is not, and you have to practice the pause. If you practice the pause before you believe, before you share, it gets easier. It gets better over time. With that being said, I want to share kind of I'm going to kind of separate this into two categories, and then I'm going to share like this really brief, quick framework that I love. So first is I'm going to talk a little about pseudoscience characteristics. I'm going to talk about what they are and like how it might present. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about dark marketing because this can show up a lot in the spaces of where these things are being sold. And then I'm going to give you all a framework that just has like 5 things to like give you a quick reminder when you're scrolling social media specifically.
Love it.
So, pseudoscience characteristics. One of the first characteristics is it's unfalsifiable. So, unfalsifiable basically means that there's no way to disprove the claim. If for some reason something doesn't work, it can explain it away. So, for example, if your child doesn't improve after the integration therapy sessions, it just means the reflex is deeply embedded and they need more time. So, no matter what, there's going to be an excuse for why something's not working. You see this in spaces where they tend to like, you're like, oh, I'm in therapy for a really, really long time. My child's been in therapy and nothing seems to be getting better. Why are things not getting better? And of course, there's always going to be nuances to that depending on your child's diagnosis. But if this is something that they claim like, we just have to integrate the reflex and like move on, and something's not changing and you're like, this isn't changing, and there's an excuse every time, pseudoscience characteristic. The next one is that they use a lot of anecdotes and testimonials. Okay, so
Mm.
emotional stories will replace scientific evidence. They don't control for any other variables. It's just like, for example, after doing starfish exercises every day, my child stopped having tantrums, and this method changed our lives. Okay, who doesn't want to get rid of tantrums, right?
Mhm.
But what other variables might have been present that led to the reduction of tantrums, for example? So those things that are really, really trigger, my child was struggling in school for, they were having trouble reading. They hadn't met their grade level reading score, XYZ, and then we did blah, 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 and now it's all better. It's like, okay, what else happened? Were they also receiving speech therapy? And were they receiving reading tutoring in school? Did they have an IEP that was allowing additional support so that they could catch up? Did they spend extra time? What else was going on? But that part's usually left out, right? So we'll see a lot of anecdotes. And if there's ever, if you ever ask for references, ask for resources, a lot of times those aren't there. The third one is that cherry picking or confirming evidence and ignoring disconfirming evidence. So like we have dozens of kids who improved after reflex integration, but it ignores that we have there's peer-reviewed studies or expert consensus that shows no measurable benefit or questions the mechanisms behind reflex integration therapy. So they're choosing to say, oh, well, I have this, we personally see all kids improve constantly. Again, was it just maturation or was it actually, because in the studies that are doing these comparisons, we're not seeing any beneficial change. And so they tend to ignore those in place of that. They're like, oh, I have this case study of 10 kids or, this cohort study of 20, but we have a systematic review, which should have significantly higher levels of evidence. It should weigh a lot higher of, 200 kids or thousands of kids or millions of kids that shows no change, right?
Totally.
So that's what we have to look at. The next thing is that there's a lot of technobabble. I love that term.
I do too. I don't think I've heard that.
Because like someone uses really complex neuroscience sounding language, but there's no actual scientific support behind it. And so they use a lot of fancy words. So like this is the example is these rhythmic movements stimulate subcortical neural pathways to reorganize retained reflex responses. I mean,
It's word
that
soup.
sounds like
It's word soup.
It is. It's like, wow, they must be so smart. No.
Yes.
No, that's just word salad. Like no. So the technobabble is big. There's a lot of like big words, very neuroscience-y tends to be present.
Yes.
Lacking plausibility. So this is like a really big oversimplification of something. So for example, retained primitive reflexes are the root cause of ADHD, sensory issues, and learning disabilities. As we talked about, it's not as simple as that. It's much more complex. Retained primitive reflexes are actually more likely a symptom than a cause. But pseudoscience will just like blanket statement, put it out there, and it's a huge oversimplification when in reality, like that's probably not likely. So it lacks that plausibility. Okay, then we have that the claims they made are unchanging. So in the face of new evidence, in the face of new information, they're going to be resistive to changing anything. So for example, these exercises have been used for decades. We don't need new research because we know it already works. But if we have new research that comes about, and that's something I always like to emphasize, like with scientists would love to be known they proved something wrong. Like they would love nothing more than to be like, your theory was wrong because when I controlled for XYZ, it didn't show it to be true. Like scientists aren't testing things because they want it to work. Of course, they want things to work. They hope it does, right? My hypothesis is that it's going to work. But if it doesn't, that sometimes provides them even more information about how to move forward. And so, when we see like, well, this one person published multiple studies showing it works, but they have a huge financial conflict of interest in those studies, something to be cautious about. But then this person who doesn't have a conflict of interest financially has shown no cause, or no beneficial outcome. We'd have to be aware of that, but this person will remain unchanging. They'll be like, well, regardless, I already know it works. I don't need your study to tell me what I already know. Next, they use extraordinary or exaggerated claims without sufficient evidence. So like 10 minutes of daily reflex work can eliminate dyslexia, picky eating, and bedwetting. It's like, whoa, that is a huge claim. dyslexia, picky eating, bedwetting all being related to each other to begin with, and then them all coming together into this like one specific thing, and there's no rigorous data to support, big red flag. It's a very exaggerated claim. Then we have professes certainty or talks of proof with great confidence. Like, we know all children with retained moral reflex struggle socially unless it's integrated. And that can be scary. But it also implies this cause effect certainty with ignoring what we actually know about development and how it's very nuanced and like very individualized, and we can have a lot of variations even within that. Then we have commits logical fallacies. So logical fallacies are basically their flaws in arguments or flaws in reasoning to try to make one side of an argument stronger. It lacks in actual like rationality. So some examples of this would be like, there's something called the false cause or the post hoc fallacy. So this would be like, we started primitive reflex exercises and now my child sleeps better. Clearly the reflexes were the reason for his sleep issues. But just because two things happen in sequence doesn't mean that one caused another. There could be a lot of other explanations, like developmental maturation, routine changes, nutrition changes. Like, there can be a lot of other factors that are going on there. So just because two things happen together doesn't mean that they were correlated or causal of each other.
Yeah.
Another example would be like a false dilemma. So this is one I feel like I see a lot. And this is kind of like the either or fallacy. So like, if you don't do reflex integration, your child will continue to struggle with focus and coordination. But this only gives you two options. It's reflex integration therapy or fail. And it's ignoring that we have other valid interventions like occupational therapy, physical therapy, just typical developmental variation that can occur.
Yes.
So it's not an either or. Like, there are a lot of other options available that we should be considering. And then there's two more. So the 10th one is that it lacks peer review. So this is where a lot of the information shared goes directly to the public and they avoid scientific scrutiny. So they go directly to sharing on social media, news outlets, blogs, onto like anything that they can share and avoid that scientific scrutiny. This would be like selling online courses and certifications and reflex integration directly to parents without any publication in reputable journals or randomized controlled trials to support what's being done. And they tend to like just skip over that entirely. And this leads a little bit into the last one, which is there's a claim that there's a conspiracy to suppress their ideas. So like, traditional medicine doesn't want you to know about reflex integration because it would make pediatricians and therapists obsolete. So like, there's gatekeeping the truth, when in reality, usually scientists or healthcare providers are challenging it because there's just a lack of something. And so those are the like main, and I know that's a lot to like go over, those are the main characteristics of pseudoscience. And so just starting to become more aware of those, like starting to pay attention to some of those things. I would say that like the biggest ones I see are like the anecdotes, the technobabble, the exaggerated extraordinary claims, and the lack of evidence. They're kind of like the big ones you'll notice when just like scrolling on social media.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of them too are really rooted, even whether it's intentional or unintentional, it's questionable, but I feel like a lot of them are truly just rooted in like manipulation of something, right? Manipulating emotion, manipulating the information in a way that works for your whatever
narrative. Yeah.
Just manipulation across the board. And I think that even just parents, like, even if it's hard for you to take in all of those things, if something in your gut feels manipulative, like, listen to that. Like, if you're like, whoa, that really, like, maybe not even manipulative, but just tapped into your emotion. Like, if you see something and it immediately makes you feel emotional in some way, that is, for me, the time that, like, pause, move away from it for a minute, come back to it later, really try to tear it apart. Because I feel like, again, it is intentional or unintentional manipulation in some way in a lot of these situations, you know?
Absolutely. And the intention is such a tricky one to navigate. That's something in a lot of the, like in my PhD studies on misinformation and disinformation, kind of like the primary difference is disinformation has an intent to cause harm. Misinformation does not have the intent. But how do you prove intent, right? We can't even prove intent in a court of law half the time, you know, like, so that can be really, really hard. So I like what you said about going back of like, it doesn't matter the intent. What matters is how it made you feel.
Mhm.
And then that's enough to say, let me pause and reflect. Like, let me just take a second. Does this seem too good to be true? Because it probably is. Does this
Mhm.
seem like, oh, this tiny little treatment can help with a laundry list of things? Probably not. Probably not likely going to happen. And I think kind of going into the second piece I want to talk about before I share that like really brief framework is dark marketing tactics. Dark marketing tactics pull into that as well. So they tend to use a lot of triggering and traumatic stories. So that emotional appeal. And when people share something super vulnerable, super traumatic, or your cognitive ability to challenge or want to challenge that information goes down. It goes down automatically. Like it is a psychological tactic that is used because you feel now, right? Like the emotion is
Wow.
out there. And so that's a really, really big one. So a lot of times you'll see like this long story about, oh, this child, this happened to them, and then blah, 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 and oh, this and that, and then they tried this, and oh, there's hope, and like it's super triggering. So those tend to be shared a lot, which goes again into the anecdotes and testimonials. So it's used in dark marketing too. The other thing with dark marketing is what's called sales tropes. So sales tropes are ways to kind of like sell you on something in a non-ethical manner. So this might be things like on the sales pages, they don't list their prices to stuff. You have to like go through multiple levels before you can find out how much something costs. They use that guilt-inducing language, don't you want to invest in your child's future? Or, investing to make sure they don't continue to have difficulties, or using a lot of those word salads. So those are those sales pages that you have to like scroll for like 5 minutes before you can figure
Mhm.
out like how much this thing's going to cost or what it's going to be, because they're just word salading you with all that technobabble. And it's like,
Mhm.
those are sales tropes. Like those are ways to trick you, manipulate you into thinking you have to have this and you need to have this. The other one is appealing to authority is a big one that's used. That's also a logical fallacy. So this is like fake authority. So really pay attention to the credentials of people. I have a few examples I could give you.
Same, same. Same, same.
But one example that comes to mind for me that I share all the time because it's just so blatantly like what is there's a person on Instagram that shares to be like a reflux specialist. Like they, which for the record is a medical diagnosis. Okay. They claim to be this reflux specialist, and the person's credentials are that they were an engineer and are now a mom. They had a child with reflux, and now they're sharing courses to families. They'll sell you to go through this app to figure out XYZ with your child. And I know we're going to talk about reflex on another episode because like actually it can be very normal. And again, we're pathologizing something developmentally normal. Of course, there's times it's not, but like that's one. But it's like if you didn't go to that person's website and read about them, you would not realize they're misrepresenting who they are, their
Mhm.
credentials, and what they can do. The same thing with if we see like occupational therapy assistants, physical therapy assistants, SLPAs, like speech language pathology assistants, that has a totally different scope and training compared to a certified occupational therapist or physical therapist. And we have to be really careful because for a lot of those, I know like for SLPAs, for example, they do not do assessments and treatment plans. They just implement the treatment that a speech language pathologist has developed. So if
Yes.
I see someone developing treatment plans or coming up with like things specific to certain diagnoses who does not have the training or credentials to do so, that is something to be really careful about because people will over exaggerate what is within their scope, what is appropriate to
Like,
be doing. And that one really, really gets me because they present of like, I'm in, I don't know, OTA, I think it's COTA, certified occupational therapy assistant, but that person can't develop treatment plans on their own at all. So if they're
mhm.
developing something individualized to your child, like that's a huge red flag. Huge red flag.
I think part of that too is also with how much more common it is for professionals to have the doctor title. I think
Yeah.
it can be extremely challenging for a lay person to understand if it's not being clearly noted that I am Dr. Casey Rickard, physical therapist, PT, DPT. It can
Yep.
be very confusing if I'm just presenting myself as Dr. Casey. You might think that I
Yep.
have different
MD
training
or
than I actually
DO.
do. Exactly. And I think that to me is very confusing. And I think many professionals try really intentionally to make sure it is not confusing and that they are clearly stating what exactly their area of their scope of practice, their area of expertise is. But
And if
and
they're not, that's when you should be concerned, because they
totally,
should be. They should
totally,
super care about being overly transparent about who
totally.
they are, what their training is, what's okay for them to say. And if they're not, they're hiding for a reason.
Hmm.
Like that, if it takes you going to their website and scrolling for a while and it's not even fully, obvious there, and you're going and you're like, well, what's their train? That is a red flag. It should be
Hmm.
beyond obvious.
Hey friends, Casey here. If you've ever listened to an episode and thought, I wish she'd go even deeper, or I wonder what she really thinks about that, I am so excited to share More Than Milestones Unfiltered, where I do exactly that. More Than Milestones Unfiltered is my private Substack community where I share 2 exclusive podcast episodes every single month. 2 episodes that will never make it to Instagram or the public feed. These are the even more raw, unfiltered stories, harder conversations, and the that's a story for another day moments I usually hold back on. If you want to join me there, just head to the show notes or my link in bio and subscribe. I'd love to see you inside.
So the last thing I want to share is this framework, and it was developed by Dr. Jessica Stokes Parrish. And she's amazing. And also, like, subtle shout out that I had her on my podcast actually to go
Oh,
through this
that's
more
cool.
in depth. But I'm
Wow.
going to just kind of share like the basics of it. So she created this framework that's called crabs. And in a nutshell, it's designed to really be like that first glance of content online. It's not a deep dive. It's not to say like, this is the end all be all, but it's meant to be like, let me just go through this acronym. And if any of these things are screaming out to me that there might be a problem, then I should just pause. I should look into it more. I should give myself some grace in what I'm seeing. Okay, so the first is conflicts of interest. So this is any conflict of interest that you see present, right? So this could be like somebody who is like, hi, I'm sharing that you should buy this thing because they paid me to do it, right? And I always say like it's not a matter of like the conflict of interest being present or not, whether you should trust the person or not, but it should lead you to pause. It should lead you to take a second. And when it is in a more subtle manner is a little bit more concerning. So someone that almost seems to be like hiding that it's an affiliate, right? Like you do a great job, Casey, of being like, this is an affiliate code. Okay. Like this is what that
Oh
is.
my God.
And that's what it should be. It should be transparent because the person should feel that you don't have to trick them into something, right? It's like, hey, I'm just giving you like this because like I found benefit to it, or like they gifted me this. I tried it. Here's what I think about it. Like it can be beneficial, but we want the person to be like, this is an affiliate code. Okay. If you
Hmm.
click this, I could get some money from it, but I'm sharing it to you anyway, right? But recognizing that some people that do that, it can be a red flag because you have some people that say like, don't use this type of intervention, use this and buy it from me and do that, right? Because like, okay, now we're getting into it being a little bit fishy here, or like,
Hmm.
the whole like, you don't need speech therapy, take this supplement that I sell and your child will all of a sudden learn to speak. I've seen one of those recently and I'm like,
Have you?
yes. Oh, the app. Oh, that one drives me crazy. But you
Hmm.
see the idea, right? Like for conflicts of interest, like we need to be aware that like there might be something going on there. The second is references. References can be used to identify whether there is evidence to back up a claim or not. It can also help with like recognizing plagiarism that exists. But for caregivers, what we want to note is just, are there references? That's the first step. The second step is determining whether or not the references are also, if they even make sense to what's being said. So with references, I have had people make claims and they have their little references at the end or in their caption. And I actually go to read them because I'm that person, and they are not related at all. I saw one time that was about like some open mouth breathing, whatever crap. And one of their references was like feeding difficulties in autism. That you put the DOI for that doesn't even make sense. It is not even relevant. So unfortunately, predatory publishing is becoming more problematic. And so we can see things be published in journals that are not upheld to as high of standards. Identifying references is step one. but we would want to actually check in terms of the quality of those. Next is author. So we have the C and the R. So we have conflicts of interest, references. A is author. This is just who's the author? Are they trained and qualified to talk about this? Are they currently practicing? Do they have any publications? Like, who are they? Who is this person? And do they have the credentials to talk about it? Because that can give you a clue into like the validity of what they're saying. Next is buzzwords, which goes into that technobabble. So this could be a sign that the information's not credible. If they use a lot of jargon, a lot of those fancy neuroscience-y words, emotive language. So language that really sucks you in and it then overrides the rational part of your thinking. Like I mentioned before, someone shares an emotionally triggering story, the rational part of your brain starts to go away because you're identifying with that. It can even be using trendy words like low tox or holistic. Holistic is one that really gets me because if you are a healthcare provider, you should be providing holistic care base level. So when someone uses holistic to mean outside of that, I'm like, I get so upset because like, oh, that's what everyone should be doing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they're using those words that are like trendy or feel good or invoke emotions, but also could be like that techno-babbly, like science word salad. And then the last one, scope of practice. And scope of practice, overreaching this is so much easier to do online than in person. And so it kind of creates this like halo of authority. So this is where, like you said, Casey, it can be difficult to identify, like, is this a doctor like an MD or a DO, or is this a chiropractor? Or is this a doctor of physical therapy and doctor in all, or is it a doctor like PhD research doctorate, you know, not even clinically based or medically based. And so that doesn't mean this person can't talk on certain topics or can't be credible, but they might be going outside of their scope a little bit in certain areas when they start talking about, you know, those different, the things that are outside of the scope. So having credentials is one thing, speaking within your scope is another.
Totally.
So paying attention to those as well. So CRABS, that quick acronym, conflict of interest, references, author, buzzword, scope of practice.
And you know what? We will put the link to your podcast episode with her in
Perfect.
in the notes so that people can just go right to it if they want to learn a little bit more about that too.
Cool. Awesome.
Okay, so we're getting close to wrapping it up, guys, but I think really quickly, let's just talk about why checking references really matters. So because you see the citation, like you talked about, they can be completely unrelated, right? They could be the abstract could be very, very different from what is really in the paper or what is being claimed in the paper, right? So we know that not all studies are created equal. We know that there's things like bias. We know that there's marketing tools. We know there's control groups, conflicts of interest, all those things. And I would love for you to just quickly talk about predatory journals and because I think for a lay person, that sounds like it wouldn't be real, right? Like there's no way that a paper could look like it's a legitimate thing if it hasn't gone through that scientific process, but it happens all the time. And so what is the important part about predatory journals for parents to understand?
Yeah. So I think with predatory journals, first of all, like, okay, science and pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is called pseudoscience because it looks so similar to science. It's meant to mimic and look very, very close to science, but it's not, okay? Like it's fake science. But because pseudoscience really wants to look real, they will create their own journals. They'll create their own conferences. They'll have boards. They'll have all the things that look very similar to what we see in actual scientific departments and journals and boards, but it's completely not based on the merit of the studies. So
which is terrifying.
It's so terrifying. And it's hard even as a professional. Like sometimes I see something, I'm like, someone will send me a study. They're like, what do you think of this study? And I'm like, wait, what? And I'm like reading through it. And then I go, hold on, where was this published? And then I go back to see where it was published. And it's like, okay, they do not have the same rigorous process for publications. And a lot of times if you see a study that you're like, no way that could be true, like this just seems crazy, and you're reading it and you're like, this doesn't make any sense. A lot of times that will tell you like, well, it probably got published in one type of journal, which oftentimes is a predatory journal, versus other ones because it wouldn't have met that criteria. It would not have been published in a high quality journal. So a predatory journal typically don't follow the same process, the same rigorous process for publication, okay? So when someone is going through editing for publication in a legit journal, it is intensive. A lot of times they'll get denied. They'll have to go to a different journal, or they'll have to make edits. They have to make changes through that review board, because that review board is saying like, I want to make sure you thought about everything. I want to make sure your interpretation makes sense for the data that you presented. A predatory journal, you just pay to publish. A lot of times that's also not disclosed. They don't disclose that they just pay to publish. So sometimes you'll also see like there is a push to have more open access research, but sometimes that is used by predatory journals to be like, no, we want to get this information out there. We make everything open access, but in reality, someone just paid to have it published. Sometimes they will falsify very important information. Titles, like in studies, when you see them, right? So you're saying like, sometimes you'll see a title and abstract, you're like, what? And then you actually read the article and you're like, that is not what that said. I want everyone to always think about like titles as like the marketing tool. Titles are meant to make you click. Titles are meant to draw you in. So someone might have a study that showed nothing happened, but their title looks really good. It's like, oh, is this going to be the thing? And then you're like, it told me nothing, but thank you. Because it's just meant to draw you in. They want you to click. They want you to use the studies. Abstracts are very similar to that, but all that to say, with the predatory journals, they sometimes don't use a peer review, or the peer review process. If you look at who's on the board of that journal that is reviewing them, they are all people that agree with what's going on. So I'm going to give you just a really brief example. And again, like, I'm not giving this example to say that like if you use this type of intervention, it's always inappropriate, okay? But it is considered an alternative therapy. If you're using it complementary, kudos to you. That's totally fine. But for example, acupuncture. There's a lot of acupuncture journals that are predatory journals. They publish anything that shows that acupuncture showed benefit. You just have to pay to do it. They have their own conferences. They have their own this. But if you look at the peer review, like who the board is, they're all acupuncturists. They're all people that agree with what's being said. And so that goes into the pseudoscience, right? Of like trying to avoid scientific scrutiny. They want to avoid those that would actually scrutinize the outcome, the methods, the quality of those studies. Some ways to kind of like know if a journal's predatory, because it can be really, really hard to know. If you Google the name of the journal with predatory, you might see some information that comes up, because there's some that are versus not. And then there's also Beall's list. This is someone who is a roundup of journals and publishers that are considered predatory. And it does get updated. That really tells you like this is a journal that's predatory, and so you need to be cautious about what you're reading from it. So that's kind of like a quick, easy way to look at it. Like there's some journals that have surprised me where I'm like, oh wait, what? I didn't realize that was like super predatory versus others. You know, just taking a minute to Google it can be helpful. And again, just like all this goes back to, right? If something is like emotionally triggering, broad, exaggerated claims, makes you feel icky, you might not even need to look at the references, because it probably is just not a thing. It's probably not worth it. But if you want to dive deeper, because again, all of these things will get easier with time as you practice them, hopefully that's a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, that is such helpful information. Again, I know that was a lot to take in, and I hope that more than anything, what anyone listening takes from this is that like truly some people may really, really have seen success. Retained primitive reflexes are absolutely real. They're absolutely a thing. But it's so important to be looking further and be really asking the questions. Ask the questions, look into things a little bit more. Try not to let that emotional piece guide you when it comes to things that you are spending your time and your energy and your money and all of it on, you know? And I hope that this was helpful to kind of break down what primitive reflexes are, what retained primitive reflexes are and aren't, and kind of just helping you gauge if that is an avenue that you think you might want to go down, helping you gauge how to do that in a way that is really in the best interest of the big picture, the whole picture for your child or your family member or whoever that may be. But Bree, thank you so much. That was amazing. I'm super excited, and I hope that everyone listening enjoyed it and got something from it. And yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I was so excited when you said to talk about this topic. And I think, too, it's like such a great topic for us to hit as a speech English pathologist and a physical therapist, like for us to both come into it from those angles, because, yeah, there's a lot of overlap in what is said about it. And so, yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right.